Thornton. Ed Thornton, a 19-year-old quartermaster third class from Three Notch, Alabama, hurried to the conning tower hatch and slid down the ladder into the control room after telling the captain that he was needed in the conning tower. Thornton hurried along the dark, winding hallways to Lieutenant Commander Eli Thomas Reich's tiny chamber, passing via the control room and into the forward battery. On the Balao-class USS Sealion, SS-315, the 31-year-old commander was dozing off from the fits of annoyance that plagued him and his crew. With the exception of a surface gun encounter with a trawler that Sealion was unable to sink, Sealion had been patrolling the northern portion of the Luzon Strait, an expressway for Japanese war and trade ships, for 10 days without encountering any action. The atmosphere on board the USS Sealion was as drab as the bulkheads that kept the submariners in. Thornton noticed that the green privacy curtain was drawn as he got closer to Reich's stateroom. Thornton recalled being instructed not to touch the captain in order to wake him. Thornton silently inserted his head through the green drape. Before Thornton could finish speaking, Reich was pushed up on his elbow and said, "Captain?" Reich immediately jumped out of bed, put on his slippers, and made his way to the conning tower after hearing the words, "You're needed in the conning tower." Reich, dressed in powder blue pajamas, arrived as radar operator Danny Brooks, and Lieutenant Clayton Brailsford hovered over the radar. When the pips flashed on the radar screen on November 21st, 1944, 20 minutes after midnight, Reich discovered that enlisted torpedo man Bill Moose Horncole was on radar watch, pulling the noose tighter around the Southwest and Central Pacific. Reich could not believe it. The distance of 44,000 yards was just too great. At nearly 13,000 feet, the Shuaishan mountain range is located in northern Formosa. Reich reasoned that the Formosan mountains must be reflecting the SJ radar signal. USS Sealion's radar had misidentified land as Japanese Navy vessels a few nights before. Had it occurred once more? Reich decided it would be wise to keep following and informed his soldiers that he would be going back to the conning tower soon. Reich hurried back to his stateroom to change since a commanding commander in combat should not be dressed in powder blue pajamas. After 4 days at sea, Admiral Takeo Kurita of the Imperial Japanese Navy was rushing back to Japan on board Yamato, one of the largest battleships in the world, together with her sister, ship Musashi. Kurita's ships just avoided an American carrier plane raid on November 16th while docked in Brunei, a tiny country on the huge island of Borneo, southwest of the Philippines. Yamato engaged the American planes that were attacking by using its anti-aircraft cannons. Admiral Kurita quickly ordered his first strike force to leave Brunei when the American pilots withdrew. Admiral Chester Nimitz's naval triumphs throughout the Central Pacific during the summer of 1944, along with Admiral Bull Halsey's naval triumphs and General Douglas MacArthur's ground victories in the Philippines that fall, put all Japanese forces in the South China Sea, including the First Strike Force, in jeopardy as the Americans tightened their noose around the Central and Southwest Pacific. Kurita was committed to safely bringing his soldiers and ships back to Japan. The Japanese approach to Formosa. Kurita directed his first strike force to circle Formosa to the west 2 days after evading the American air assault on Brunei. By November 19th or 20th, an American task force could arrive in Formosa, according to Japanese intelligence. By moving west of Formosa, Kurita and his troops could enjoy the safety of shallow water, a powerful current, and Japanese aircraft positioned on the Chinese coast to the west and the Formosan coast to the east. The USS Sealion was one of 4 U.S. submarines that unintentionally sank prison ships containing American, British, and Australian prisoners of war 2 months prior to attacking Admiral Take Kurita's ships. Here, Sealion is rescuing the prisoners of war from the Rakuyo Maru. In order to defend the Asian coast against an eastern naval attack, the Japanese laid a strategic minefield that stretched from the northern tip of Formosa along the Ryukyu Islands and up to Honshu. It was thought that under such dangerous circumstances, an American attack by submarine, surface ships, or air would be challenging to carry out. Kurita's strike group entered the Formosa Strait unopposed around midday on November 20th. Kurita was certain that the most perilous portion of the journey home was over, as was his esteemed guest on Yamato, Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, who until 4 days ago had been the commander of the 1st Battleship Division aboard Yamato. The 1st Strike Force was expected to reach Japan in 4 days. At around midnight, Ugaki was standing on Yamato's bridge. Yamato's radar had picked up enigmatic signals, which alarmed him and anyone nearby. The officers' perspectives were changing as a result of the waves moving. The officers must have discussed the likelihood that an American submarine would breach the minefield, make it to the northern Luzon Strait, and then assault a strike force of that magnitude. There was every evidence that Yamato's radar had detected American B-29s on patrol because of the way the radar waves were traveling, and the remote possibility that an American submarine, either by itself or in a wolf pack, could have penetrated so deeply. Despite being alerted to possible aviation or submarine activity nearby, the ships in the 1st Strike Force were instructed to continue their course. To get home, Kurita had decided to stop zigzag movements, start the engines, and intimidate everyone. Combat Rear Admiral Ugaki was at ease with Kurita's choice. Confident in the strength of the 1st Strike Force, which included 3 battleships, Kongō, Nagato, and Yamato, and 4 escort destroyers, Ugaki went back to his room to sleep with just a few hours till daybreak. The Japanese naval force and the USS Sealion established radar contact. The sub was closing in at 30,000 yards from what was now thought to be the enemy when Reich returned to Sealion's conning tower in 15 minutes. The many yellow pips that still flashed on the green radar screen matched the appearance of the pips when they made contact with large ships. Reich verified that a sizable Japanese naval force had established radar contact with Sealion. On November 21st, Reich instructed Communications Officer Joe Bates to file a ship contact report and summoned combat stations at 12:46 a.m. Before making the report, Bates hurried to the radio shack and dialed Reich, who was now on the bridge with Harry Hagen, the engineering officer. A wary sailor, Bates requested Reich to figure out just how many ships he should report and what kind of ships. Reich retorted, excited by the events that were developing, "Damn it, Bates! Nimitz isn't asking for an affidavit. Point." Whispers concerning the size of the target spread from bow to stern, and all soldiers rushed to their combat stations, causing activity aboard Sealion to proceed at a frenetic speed. After pushing out from the radar, Horncoal rushed to the forward torpedo room, where he teamed up with Torpedo Man 3rd Class Bill Lavender and Chief Torpedo Man Joe Bell. In order to fire 6 Mark 18 torpedoes loaded with 575 pounds of Torpex, they needed to ensure that all 6 bow tubes were prepared. On October 31st, 1943, the 2nd Sealion, SS-315, was launched in Groton, Connecticut. In December 1941, the 1st Sealion, SS-195, was damaged in the Philippines and had to be scuttled. Inside the control room, Bill Scarano, a boatswain's mate from Groton, Connecticut, which is just a mile from the location where the USS Sealion was constructed and launched, operated his station on the bow planes. George Davis, who flew the stern planes, was by his side. James Oots, the boat's chief, was standing nearby, prepared to keep an eye on the hull opening indicator panel, which is referred to as the Christmas tree, due of its red and green lights. Reich was prepared to activate the klaxon alert and sink the control room. Left full rudder. The Sealion gets closer to its prey. Reich, however, did not choose to dive the boat. 2 hours after first contact, the Japanese strike force was just under 20,000 yards from the Sealion and traveling at 17 knots, which was described as a damn good speed. Fighting the East China Sea's conditions made it even harder for the sub to close at surface speed. Reich and Hagen were soaking and windswept on the bridge at 2 in the morning, and they couldn't recognize anything in front of them. Quartermaster William Pearson, the lookout, also had trouble seeing in the darkness due to the heavy fog. The personnel in the conning tower would be in charge of the attack scope, radar, and torpedo data computer if the Sealion were to successfully do an end run and maneuver in front of the strike force. Reich told Joe Bates, who was using the torpedo data computer for the first time, Looks like you've got good dope down there, Joe. Reich's ability to lead was evident. Rudder left full. The skipper gave the order for the last turn. Reich was able to move Sealion ahead of the strike force and wait for its target at 2:45 a.m. While there was excitement and impatience on the bridge outside, there was a mix of worry and excitement in the conning tower. Reich and Hagen knew there was a large Japanese strike force ahead, but they were unable to see despite their best efforts to squint and wipe the ocean spray from their eyes. The crew wondered if they were pursuing a task force of battle wagons, aircraft carriers, or both. In the conning tower, Thornton and the cops surrounding him were working tirelessly, and the more they discovered, the more tense they became. On the bridge, Executive Officer Jim Bryant, who was adored by everyone on the Sealion, expressed his worry to Reich while keeping his eyes fixed on the attack scope. Sealion was only a few thousand yards from the destroyers on the port side of the main column, and Bryant wasn't sure he should run so close on the surface. Reich, however, would not budge. Reich was sure the enemies couldn't see him if he couldn't see them. Bryant called up to Reich that the fire control party in the conning tower was prepared to fire. Reich thought Bryant would rather fire from a safe distance, but doing so would put the torpedoes at risk of launching unpredictably. "We need to close this person, so let me worry about that," Reich informed Bryant. As he fought the storms and waves on the bridge, directing Sealion closer, Reich demonstrated his pugnacious fighting style, which was well known even during his Annapolis days. Reich knew, as did Bryant, that he was pushing his luck. Bryant obediently told Reich, 3,500 yards for a torpedo run. Reich decided it was now or never at 2:50 a.m. "We'll turn around and remove the stern as soon as you remove your bow," he said. "Just steady the solution," to Bryant. Joe Bates had the torpedo data computer operating without a hitch, thus the answer was set. As directed by Reich, Moosehorn Cole, who was in the forward torpedo room, fixed the depth of the 6 fish at 8 feet. In the conning tower, Reich shouted directions to Bryant and Bates. "Okay, shoot when you're prepared. You're ready to go. Go ahead and fire. Point." The entire sky was illuminated, and all 6 tin fish were in the water. The USS Sealion was prepared to strike from 3,000 yards out. Bryant said, 6 fires, 5 fires, 4 fires, 3 fires, second fire, let's fire 1. At 2:56 a.m., the firing circuits were pressed. Hot, straight, and normal, the 6 forward tin fish leaped from their tubes and raced in the direction of the battleship Kongō, the second ship in the column. The 6 have all been let go. Before daybreak on November 21, 1944, Sealion torpedoed the Urakazi, one of Kongō's accompanying destroyers in the South China Sea, causing it to sink in a matter of seconds. Rudder to the full right. Point. Pearson was the first sailor on Sealion to recognize the pagoda mast as belonging to the Kongō-class battleship's namesake. Pearson, a surface ship veteran, saw the Japanese battle wagon as Sealion rotated hard to bring the stern into position. 3 stern tubes joined the assault and rushed for the battleship Nagato, the third ship in the column, 3 minutes after the front fish started attacking the strike force. Billy Mansfield and the engine operators rammed the Sealion into the flank and sped off. With 3 battleships and 4 destroyers battling for their lives, one submarine would not survive long on the surface if there were no fish in the tubes. The scene in front of them caused the conning tower to roar. Whoa. Point. The entire sky became bright. Point. "They'll be put in dry dock for that." Yamamoto Takika, who was on board Kongō with a 25mm gun, awoke from a deep slumber. His body trembled as he heard and felt the grinding of steel after hearing the tremendous boom. He had a gut feeling that a submarine torpedo had struck his ship. Yamamoto sprinted for his 25mm gun mount across the Kongō deck. Yamamoto pondered the reason behind the shooting into the sky by those already at the guns. He was certain that torpedoes from a submarine, not an airplane, had struck the belly of the Kongō. Many aboard Kongō were in a state of panic. However, the ship's second battery officer, Major Takahata Yutaka, maintained his composure. Takahata, like Yamamoto, was aware that Kongō had just been hit by an enemy submarine's barrage of blows. He was certain that Kongō would remain afloat, despite the fact that torpedoes had pierced the front and middle parts of the ship on the port side. This was true regardless of the list that had already begun to form. Kongō was a well-built, experienced battleship that had previously survived near misses with American bombers. This most recent attack would undoubtedly be handled by her. Kongō's starboard escort, the destroyer Urikaze, was not as fortunate. The Nagato and Yamato reacted swiftly and spun violently on the helm when they saw the flames and waters shoot above Kongō. Yamato and Nagato maneuvered fast enough to avoid being hit by Sealion's stern torpedoes. Sealion's stern torpedoes, which were now on the column's starboard side, tore through the Urikaze's side at 3:04 in the morning. Massive flames sprang out from the explosion, lighting up the sky above the ship before swiftly going out. Within a few seconds, the victim had sunk to the sea floor beneath the East China Sea's waves. There was no time to halt down to assist those in need on Kongō or look for Urikaze survivors. The strike group thought they had sailed into an ambush because of the unexpected explosion and sinking of Urikaze on the starboard side of Kongō. The battle wagons, after the Urikaze. Admiral Kurita ordered Yamato and Nagatoto to keep heading north into Japan at full speed. Kurita then gave Kongō the command to travel to a seaport city on the northeastern coast of Formosa that was under Japanese control. Kongō was seen to have a realistic chance of arriving to the safety offered by Keelung's harbor, while being escorted by the destroyers Isokaze and Hamikaze and still managing to achieve 16 knots. Admiral Ugaki, who was relieved that Kongō was doing as well as she did, believed the ship would make it out alive. Ugaki left the Yamato bridge based on his supposition. There was a lot of agitation in the control room, torpedo chambers, and conning tower of Sealion. Below the conning tower, within the control room, Scarano was listening to what he could via the open hatch. He could hear Reich's lament, "I think I set the torpedoes too shallow." Reich was correct. The torpedoes, which were fired to run barely 8 feet deep, struck Kongō's armor plate. An 8-foot depth setting was too shallow for battleships, but suitable for destroyer escorts. Reich became irritated as the gap between Kongō and the USS Sealion grew. That wasn't good. Reich informed Bryant, "You would have had a pretty good setup if you had fired on the last ship." Sealion sank the formidable Japanese battleship Kongō on November 21, 1944, while it was returning to Japan after the Battle of the Philippine Sea, dislodging 37,000 tons. Bryant answered, "I thought we were on the last one, Captain." Reich wanted the battle wagons, but sinking Urikaze was fine. The fish buried in Urikaze may have been slammed through Yamato's hull if Sealion had waited a little longer. Suddenly, 800 yards away, Yamato, which had ceased zigzagging, glided through the fog past the stern of the Sealion, silhouetted against the dark sky. Bates was certain that Yamato would have been impossible to miss if Sealion had even one torpedo in the tube. There were more fish on board, but the tubes were empty. Standing between the tubes in the forward torpedo room, Moose Horncole heard the intensity in Reich's voice over his headset. "I need those torpedoes ready now. Point." Reich liked a good brawl and was never one to back down. A desperate push to get another fish into firing position. Moose Horncole, Bill Lavender, and Joe Bell went to work. The forward tubes were now full with seawater. This was typical, but it was also a problem. The torpedo tube's outer door opened to discharge the torpedo when it was fired, but as it left the tube, seawater entered. The reload crew had to pump the water back into the sea in order to reload the torpedoes into the tubes. However, the sub would lose valuable time if they did so in a circumstance like the one Sealion was in. Horncole advised his chief torpedo man, Joe Bell, to dump water from the tubes into the bilges. Bell concurred. In order to clarify the situation, the forward torpedo room phoned the pump room. There wasn't much time, so the only thing to do was to yank the tube's plug. The bilges already contained a lot of water and oil and were closely watched, so it was not a good idea to dump the water into them. The pump room was run by Stephen Gorski, a big man who was regarded as an auxiliary expert. He was well aware of the danger and made sure the pumps were operating as quickly as possible. Horn, Cole and Company started feeding the torpedo tubes when the water level monitor indicated that they were empty. The front torpedo crew fixed the block and tackle on a ring within the tube and pushed the torpedo skids into place. The men were prepared to push the fish into firing position after hooking the torpedo to the block and tackle. Loading the fish was much riskier than usual because of the boat's swaying motion caused by the waves crashing against Sealion's sides. Between the 3,000-pound missile and the deck, Horn-Cole felt he would be crushed to death. "Keep that torpedo from returning to haunt us," yelled Horn-Cole. "I will not allow it to be returned to you," Bell chirped. Photographed in Truck Lagoon at some point in 1943, Yamato, Left, and Musashi are the biggest battleships in the world. Horn-Cole shimmied behind the missile and clambered onto the torpedo racks. Horn-Cole called for assistance, 2 feet on the torpedo propellers, 2 hands on the skid, and his backside between them. "Bill, push on me!" Bill Lavender had a frame similar to the underwater warhead and was around 6 feet 5 inches. Lavender leaned onto Horn-Cole's back, who was pushing straight on the torpedo, using his strength and weight to crush their backs against each other. They moved the fish into place together. "The target is no longer there. In the water, she's dead. Point." Horn-Cole had to be cautious about the amount of force he used to put the torpedo into position while moving as fast as he could. Using too much effort may have damaged the outer door by pushing it over the stops and causing it to slam against it. Only a small inside door kept the USS Sealion from overflowing and sinking to the seabed after fire controlman George Davis accidentally shot a live torpedo through number 8 tube's outside door in the post-torpedo room 4 days earlier, rendering the tube inoperable. Sealion could not afford to replace the damaged torpedo tube. One was sufficient. "Joe, it's on the stops!" With a sigh of relief, Horn-Cole called out to Bell. Bell attested. In less than 30 minutes, Moose and Bell, supported by Lavender, maneuvered the torpedoes into the forward tubes. Reich now had 6 forward torpedoes at his disposal, ready for action. The clock read 4:06 a.m. Reich had heard the blasts and seen the smoke plumes rising from Kongō more than an hour earlier. The battle wagon was zigzagging at 14 knots and seemed to be gaining, which was bad news for Reich and his men. The engines of Sealion were straining to the limit, operating at a 25% overload. The forward engine room was commanded by throttleman Billy Mansfield, a submariner who had completed 9 combat patrols before joining Sealion. Reich was not happy with Mansfield, Harry Hagen, and Casey Mallow, the chief motor machinist's mate, being cautious because they were afraid of blowing the engines. Reich reluctantly heeded his engineering team's advice and lowered Sealion's speed from flank speed to about 17 knots. Foamy green saltwater soaked the bridge and pushed its way through the open hatch into the conning tower as waves lapped over and against the sub's hull and deck. Sealion had to remain on the surface to kill Kongō. For Reich, the danger was worth the gain. Danny Brooks and the people surrounding the radar screen saw 2 distinct enemy formations at 4:50 a.m., and they observed that the one closest to Sealion had slowed to 11 knots. Reich was informed that 2 destroyers and 1 battleship made up the nearest formation. Starting to look rosy again, Reich thought, it is logical to assume that the guys in the conning tower were aware of what was going on. The battleship they had hit earlier was becoming more and more limp and was unable to keep up with the other 2 ships. Reich commanded the troops in the conning tower to turn toward the halted enemy formation, employing the same strategy a pack of wolves takes to stalk their prey. The bearings that Bates placed into the torpedo data computer and fixed a solution were read out by Bryant, who had his eyes against the scope. Clayton Brailsford made a plan. Brooks gave additional positive news half an hour after he said the formation had slowed down. The target's pip on the radar screen was smaller than it had been few minutes earlier, and it was roughly 17,000 yards away. Reich got ready to fix his earlier error at 5:20 a.m. "The target has stopped," was the next statement. "She's dead in the water. Point." The situation in Kongō. from bad to worse. Kongō was not faring as well as Ugaki and Kurita had planned. The storm surge was making the wounds worse after Sealion's Mark 18 fish broke through the walls of Kongō's number 6 and number 8 boiler rooms. Kongō was hampered by the seawater's onslaught, and the ship was listing perilously near Kapazing. Kongō was listing at roughly 45 degrees, and what had been 32 yards above the sea was now touching down. Takahashi Masahiko, Kongō's gunnery officer, stood beside his anti-aircraft gun and watched the waves' lip approach. Together with the other officers on board, Commander Suzuki and Captain Shimazaki attempted to defuse the terrifying situation. Pumping the water didn't work, since the East China Sea outperformed every strategy Kongō's crew used. Lieutenant Commander Eli Reich, the skipper of Sealion, is the hunter. Admiral Takei Kurita, the commander of 1st Strike Force, and Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, the head of 1st Battleship Division, are the hunted. Even though it was risky, patching the hole was the only alternative. Captain Shimazaki saw the folly of the damage control officers' preparations to slip over the side rail as they dressed. The damage officers were considerably more likely to die in the rushing water than they were to fix the hole. The command was withdrawn by Captain Shimazaki. Every man was told to proceed to the starboard side of Kongō. They questioned if the combined weight of the seamen could overcome the port list, but the sea's strength was more than theirs. Captain Shimazaki had the ship's flag lowered shortly after the order to rush starboard was given. Kongō now made a 60-degree listing. They were about to capsize. Following the sinking of Kongō, the USS Sealion resumes its pursuit. Captain Shimazaki gave the order for everyone to leave the ship at 5:22 a.m. 2 minutes later, the forward 14-inch rounds in Kongō's magazine compartment were pushed over and fell, detonator forward toward the deck. There was a huge explosion. After a few seconds, Takahashi and Yamamoto were suddenly out of breath, not knowing how they got to where they were in the East China Sea's waves, or that over 1,000 of their fellow sailors had just died. "Oh, how fortunate the Irish are," Reich, a devout Irish Catholic, exclaimed joyfully. They were throwing metal shards into the East China Sea. Reich saw the enormous and bright flames from Kongō light up the entire sky, transforming night into day and then back into night again in a matter of seconds, despite the fact that daybreak was still 90 minutes away. The explosion was so powerful that Brooks saw the radar pip had vanished within a minute, leading him to question whether the radar had malfunctioned. "I can no longer see it." Scarano had heard and felt the explosion, and, remaining in the control room, manning the bow planes, had come to terms with his death. "We're hit," he thought. Scarano was certain that the sub had been shot to death on the hull because the blast had shaken Sealion so violently. The explosion's energy collected loose papers and caps in the control room and conning tower of Sealion, and dispersed them throughout the boat's various rooms, leaving the floors covered with debris. The atmosphere in the conning tower above Scarano was very different because they knew what was going on outside. "Whoa!" could be heard as the men in the conning tower rejoiced after learning what had transpired. Reich noted, "There's a lot of white smoke out here." Bates was relieved to hear his skipper say, "His boilers are going off." He had thought that Reich had been taken for a ride and was afraid that Sealion's bridge had been blown off the boat. Reich wasted no time in being alive. What was done was done. Reich gave Sealion the order to disregard Kongō's escorts and turned to follow the 2 battleships that had continued to sail north, saying, "All right, I'll tell you what we'll do. Typhoon force winds prevent the Sealion from reaching its objective." At this point, the storm attained typhoon-like fury, making it almost hard for Sealion to catch up from 20,000 yards. The radar captured Yamato and Nagato, going at 19 knots and 24,000 yards out within 15 minutes after Reich's command. Compared to Sealion, the battle wagon's size and strength were significantly more suited to withstand the harsh weather. Reich, however, was not giving up. Sealion stayed on the surface, beaten by furious green waves and flung to and fro by the escalating gusts. Another issue arose. More than 70 years later, Scarano remembered that green water was flowing toward the engine room through the sub's main induction shaft, like a waterfall. The salt water surged into the pump room, control room, and conning tower through the hatch. In the radio shack, 6 inches had accumulated. Reich, however, continued to hunt. He knew he had missed it, and he craved it. An image of the crowded post-torpedo compartment of an American submarine from World War II. Sealion and other Balao-class submarines were equipped with 24 Mark 14 torpedoes. But Reich had had enough after 2 hours. Taking down 2 more battleships 35,000 yards, almost 20 miles, distant was a considerably less plausible prospect than water damage to the control room and pump room circuit panels and damage to the engines. At 7:44 a.m., Sealion went under. The only American submarine to sink an enemy battleship was the USS Sealion. They would need to demonstrate it. Sealion remained below the surface for the rest of the day, as the crew cleaned up the wet interior and waited for Admiral Charles Lockwood, the commander of the Submarine Force Pacific Fleet, who was stationed at Pearl Harbor, thousands of miles away, to respond. Reich had sent Lockwood a report shortly after the raid to inform him of the recent events along the East China Sea and Formosa Strait. The message was relayed to Pearl by a radio station on the Australian coast, which Sealion had surprisingly managed to pick up. Lockwood answered quickly, and Reich got his answer the next morning, November 22nd. Reich and Sealion would need to provide proof if they wished to claim the distinction of being the only American submarine to sink an enemy battleship. Lockwood gave Reich the order to go back to the area and, if possible, pick up a survivor, because there was still a chance that Japanese sailors on Kongō had survived the explosion. Reich gave the command for Sealion to run on the surface at 5:50 a.m. and return to the coordinates where Kongō had been destroyed. Sealion prowled the seas, alone on the surface, encircled by sunlight and a vast expanse of sea, first searching for any fragment of debris that would help identify the sunken ship as Kongō. That afternoon, the sun was burning brightly, giving Sealion plenty of light to search for activity or life. The bridge's lookout sounded at 12:30 p.m. Something caught their attention. The Japanese were believed to be visible around 4 miles away, as plain as the blue sky above them. However, there were no lifeboats, bobbing heads, or floating wreckage. Rather, 2 possible Japanese Nell bombers, armed with machine guns and cannons, were observed by Sealion's lookouts as they rapidly approached the starboard quarter. The Nell bombers might reach Sealion before the boat had sunk far enough to evade Japanese weaponry, because they could fly at 230 miles per hour. Japanese Nells, or B-25s overhead. A more than capable officer who took over the deck watched half an hour before the aircraft encounter, Clayton Brailsford, seemed indifferent to the sighting. Instead of diving the boat, as all submarine officers were instructed to do when establishing contact with an unknown or enemy air patrol nearby, Brailsford requested that the SD radar be activated. As Sealion enters port, Japanese kill flags are raised. During the war, the sub received 5 battle stars and participated in 6 war patrols. Since the SD radar was one of the first air search detecting systems fitted to American fleet submarines, and frequently proven to be more frustrating than protective, it is hard to understand why Brailsford handled the matter the way he did. Brailsford called Reich to let him know what was going on. Reich yelled, "Dive the damn boat!" right away. Joe Bates, the on-duty diving officer, called for Sealion to dive after receiving the captain's orders. The sub would only be lucky enough to reach periscope depth before being hit by a bomb right on the hull. Bates, thrilled by the request, gave the order to dive at a great angle. An air bubble appeared in the bow buoyancy tank, which ran down the sub's outer forward hull, shortly after Sealion started its precipitous descent into the East China Sea. With an air bubble in the buoyancy tank, Sealion blasted back to the surface from about 120 feet below. The boat's bow appeared from under the waves, revealing her entire hull to the 2 bombers above, as they were unable to rectify the serious error before Sealion reached the surface. Only 24 hours after its heyday, Sealion had broken free. "This is the work in progress," Bates yelled. In order to send Sealion back below the surface, Bates and the people in the control room running the diving gears worked quickly. Bates had quietly expected death. 90 seconds for Sealion to recover from its almost deadly mistake. As the bombers buzzed overhead, Sealion sat on the surface like a lily pad in a pond. Every combat submariner had dreamed at least once of the explosion and the death that was imminent. But where was it? The men on board prayed. After the war, Sealion returns to Norfolk, Virginia, having accomplished her objectives. Sealion finally sank beneath the waters, amazingly unharmed after the longest 90 seconds that many of these men would ever experience. Some on board asked why they had been spared, while Sealion trimmed at 150 feet below the surface. Henry Joyce, the chief boatswain mate, thought it was divine intervention. He believed they had only survived by God's mercy. Prayer was not the only thing Reich and his officers were thinking about. They had to determine what had just transpired and if they were in the company of a friend or an enemy. Reich gave the order for the boat to periscope 60 feet, and he, Brailsford, and Bates alternately looked through Sealion's periscope at the circling aircraft. According to Brailsford, the bombers had to be American B-25s. Plans to monitor the area and search for evidence of the alleged sinking of Kongō had been announced. On a clear day, one might see from above a battleship of that size sitting on the ocean floor about 250 to 300 feet below the surface. Brailsford reasoned that the troops on Sealion would not be alive to dispute if the planes circling overhead were Japanese bombers. Reich considered surfacing and passively concurred with Brailsford. Bates couldn't understand. Bates reasoned that there was no need to wonder who was piloting the bombs. He maintained that the Philippines was too far away, and Formosa and China were too close for B-25s to be idly patrolling overhead. After much deliberation, Reich decided to support Bates. It was later determined that the two aircraft were, in fact, Japanese Nels. A disgraceful demise for the USS Sealion. Sealion cleared the area after being ordered to a depth of 100 feet and patrolled the region all day in the hopes of discovering any proof that would confirm Sealion as the sole American submarine to sink an enemy battleship. The search that day was unsuccessful. The officers and crew of the Sealion gathered around the meal tables during the next day to express gratitude for their accomplishments and survival over the preceding 48 hours. The crew of Sealion held their first Thanksgiving celebration together on Thursday, November the 23rd, 1944. They were all grateful to be alive. They enjoyed warm pumpkin pie, roasted turkey, and an inane 86 minutes of viewing The War Against Mrs. Hadley, a 1942 Hollywood thriller starring the stunning Jean Rogers. Through intelligence intercepts, the top brass back in Pearl Harbor was able to verify Sealion's spectacular win over Kongō. Admiral Chester Nimitz was so appreciative of Sealion's extraordinary heroism and the amazing achievement of achieving the only enemy battleship kill by an American submarine that he gave Eli Thomas Reich his Third Navy Cross in his many patrols. Admiral Charles Lockwood expressed gratitude for what he called a historic patrol. The entire crew of USS Sealion received the Presidential Unit Citation from President Harry Truman on October 10, 1945, less than a year later. The submarine met an unimpressive end, but she and her crew survived the war. She was employed for target practice after being deactivated and then recommissioned to serve in a number of post-war capacities. On November 8, 1978, the USS Sealion was sunk off the shore of Newport, Rhode Island. It is no longer there, but it will always be remembered.